Hello guys, welcome again to another tutorial. So today we are talking about hoisting, JavaScript hoisting to be precise. So a lot of you might have been hearing the concept hoisting or the word hoisting, and you might have been wondering, what is hoisting? So we're going to look into hoisting today. We're first going to look at the theoretical aspects, and then we're going to go into practical and see what really is hoisting. So let's move on. So first of all, we want to understand that JavaScript is an interpreted programming language. And what does that mean? This means that JavaScript is executed line by line. So which means it is synchronous by default, but there are some other libraries in which they've built asynchronous JavaScript programming into themselves, but we're not going into that today. The default JavaScript programming language executes line by line, and you must understand that. And hoisting is a behavior that happens during the compilation phase, before the code is executed. And during the compilation phase, what happens is that JavaScript actually scans through your code and find all the variables and function declaration. You must so let's underline that word, and prepares them for use even before your code starts running. And how does it prepare them for use? It moves them to the top of your you can imagine it this way, that it moves the variable and the function declaration to the top of the program. But this is not physically. This is actually happens in memory. So it's not like it's physically moving it happens in the memory. So what does this happen? And this, I remember what we said. We said it happens in the compilation phase, not the execution phase. Remember that JavaScript has two phases. You have the compilation phase and you have the execution phase. Execution phase is the phase where your program or your code runs, while the compilation phase is the phase where it compiles, it compiles down, to the language that the computer understands, which is the zeros and ones. So basically, like we've said, another way we can define, JavaScript hoisting is that it's the behavior in which variables and function declarations. You remember I said you must always understand, you must always put that word declarations. Variables and function declaration are moved to the top of their containing scope. So for example, if you're in the global scope, it's moved to the global scope. If you're in the function scope, it's moved to the function scope. But we'll get to that. Let and const are moved to the block scope, while var is moved to the function and global scope before the code executes. And we say this happens in memory, not physically. You must also understand that this literally means that regardless of where the variable and functions are declared in the code, they are treated as if they were declared at the top of their scope. Have you ever wondered why we usually declare our variables at the top of the scope? If you are writing a program in the global scope, you declare your variables at the top. Most times, that's best practices. And if you're in the functions also, you declare your variables at the top. Have you ever wondered why? We do that to avoid a whole lot of issues in hoisting. They are declared at the top of their scope, however, only the declaration are hoisted and not the actual assignment or function definition. So what that means is that it's just the declaration that is hoisted, is moved to the top, not the assignment. For example, when we declare a variable with the var keyword, for example, var name, and we run our program, it is moved. That var name, you see var name is equals to Josh. What gets moved is just the declaration, which is var name, not the assignment, which is the equals to Josh. The assignment is not moved to the top, just the declaration. So it's like we have declared all our variables at the top of, the program, at the top of the scope, whether we're in the global scope or in the function scope. Now let's talk about the types of hoisting that we have. We have the variable hoisting and we have the function hoisting. The variable hoisting, like I said previously, is where we declare a variable using the keyword var, and the declaration is moved to the top of its containing scope. You must understand the top of its containing scope, not the top of the application, the containing scope, which means if you're in a function, it's moved to the top of the function scope. If you're in a global scope, move to the top of the global scope. If you're in a block scope, it's moved to the top of the blocked scope. In memory, and the variable is created, but its value is initially set to undefined. Now, this is very, very important for you to note that even though the variable, is hoisted, but as it's hoisted, initially the value becomes undefined. This allows us to use the variable even before its declaration in the code, although its value will be undefined until you assign your own value to it. So let's look at function hoisting. Function declaration are also moved to the top of their containing scope. This means that you can call the function before actually declaring it in the code. I don't know if you've noticed, there are some functions that you might declare maybe at the bottom of your code, and then you actually call them at the top, and it runs. Maybe you might wonder, how does that happen? The technology behind that is called hoisting, but there's also a catch to it. In JavaScript, we have different types of functions. We have about 3 different types of functions in JavaScript, and we have arrow functions, we have function expression, function declarations. It is only function declarations that is hoisted. You must understand that also. Only function declaration. So we'll look into that in a couple of minutes. So let's look into that right now. So here we have an example, and in this example we have a variable called var, in which we assign 10. We assign the value of 10, and then you can see we are console logging it here before it is being assigned. Because we said JavaScript is an interpreted language, so if you are doing this, normally it should throw an error. But let us see what is going to happen here. When we run it, you can see we get undefined. Instead of it throwing an error, we get undefined. But if we comment this out, I'm going to save that. What we should have gotten is this, a reference error. But what is happening in here is that this declaration, this part of var x, is actually moved. Is moved as if it was, as if we had declared it on the top, at the top of the scope here, before calling it. If I save this and I run the program, you can see we get the same result. We get undefined 10, which is, if I remove this also, we still get the same thing. It is because JavaScript is actually hoisting, this variable behind the thing. So now let's go further and look into, so this is actually variable hoisting. And you must understand that letter const, they behave in a different way. We are going to look at that later. They are not usually hoisted to the global scope, but they are hoisted only to the block scope. And and when you try to access them before their initialization, they actually throw an error. But let's look at function hoisting here. So this is an example of function hoisting. So what is happening here is that we declared a function here, and we logged hello in the function. Remember I told you that we have different types of function. So, but now we are calling it before the declaration. You could have, let's try to guess what is going to output. It's actually going to output the hello. But remember that we are calling it before at line 10. And we say JavaScript executes line by line. Normally, when it gets to line 10, it should have thrown an error that we are trying to call a function that does not exist. But instead, it will output hello. Let's take a look at that. You can see. So it works. And that is because this whole function is a declaration, not an assignment. So we are declaring a function. This is function declaration. This type of function is called function declaration. So we are declaring a function. And the function is in the memory, what happens is as if we've moved it to the top of our program, which is like, but to remove this since we don't need that again. So it's assuming it is actually here. And if we run that, we get the same answer. So that is what we call function hoisting. But let's take a look at, we said it's only function declaration that does that. Let's take a look at other type of function and see if the hoisting actually takes place. So here we have another function, say hi. But now this is not a function declaration. This is a function expression. If you know your JavaScript very well, you know that we have different types of functions. We have arrow functions, function declaration, function expression, and we even have all these immediately invoked function. We have named function. So out of all this function, it is only function declaration, which is this, that gets hoisted. So this now, if we run this, it's going to throw an error because this is actually a function assignment. So what is happening here is that we are assigning this function to this variable. So the variable will get hoisted, but the assignment will not. So if we are trying to call it here, it will throw an error. So let's see what happens. Let's run the code. You can see say I is not a function. That is what we get. It's not a function. Let's comment this out and see just what we get there. You see, it's not defined. But if we uncomment this, it is not telling us that it is not defined. It is saying that it is not a function. Because at that point in time, when this say I is being hoisted, it's being hoisted as a variable and not a function. But we are invoking it here as a function. So that is why it's throwing an error saying, let's look into the error here. Say I is not a function. Say I is not a function. So let's take a look at another one. So I hope you understand that even if we change this to an arrow function, I can say, let me just create another function here. Say hello is equals to an arrow function, console log hello, and I comment this out, and I try to call this say hello before the initialization here. We can guess what it will tell us. Cannot access say hello before initialization, because we are doing what? We are using an arrow function. So arrow function, any other function, they are not hoisted by default, just function declaration. So now let's move on and see a little about the let and const that we talked about. Now we have here a block scope. We declare a variable called let y equals to 20. And we are logging it before the assignment, before it's assigned a value. Let's see what happens. You can see the same error we got here. Why? Because we are using const and let. Cannot access y before initialization. It's not telling us that y doesn't exist. It says it is not yet initialized, so we can't access it. But if we change this to var, we won't get an error. Instead, we'll get undefined. Okay, let's take a look at that var, and then you see we get undefined. We didn't get an error. We got undefined because y has been hoisted to the top of the scope, but the assignment was not hoisted. So y has already been there without a value. So the same thing goes with const, like we did here, like we can see here also. So if we do this, we also get the same thing, an error. If we change this to var, we won't get an error. var. So you need to understand that var get hoisted, but const and let, they are only hoisted to the blocked scope, not function scope, and not the global scope. So if I do this, we get undefined. So if we change it to let, we get an error because it's not being, it says we can access y before initialization. Let's comment this out. And then you see, it says it's not defined. So this proves to us that it is actually, hoisted to the blocked scope. Here, it is hoisted to the blocked scope, but even though it is hoisted, it still throws an error. So that's one thing you need to, if you try to access it before it's being assigned a value, you get an error. But we don't get an error when it comes to var. Instead, we get undefined. So that brings us to the end of this lesson. And I hope now you understand the difference and how hoisting occurs in the background. So thank you and see you some other time. Kindly like, subscribe, and turn on the notification icon for more content like this.